Now onto our final panel, and we're going to have a look at how user consent is collected for connected TV campaigns and discuss if the practice is universal. And as you saw it's come up multiple times in our panels, and even our audience are asking questions about it. So to lead us through this panel, we have Ninon Vagner, Privacy and Compliance Manager for IAB Europe. Over to you, Ninon.
Thank you, David. I hope everyone can hear me. So for this discussion dedicated to user consent and privacy on CTV, I am joined by 3 speakers. Oh, I think my video is not on. Just 1 second. Yeah, now it's working. So for this discussion dedicated to user consent and privacy on CTV, I am joined by 3 speakers who have great expertise in the CTV space and knowledge of the applicable legal requirements and the European Data Protection Framework. We are going to start with a short roundtable to let them introduce themselves and their companies. Lukas, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. And also welcome to everyone who's listening in from my side. I'm Lukas. I'm leading our solutions engineering team for what we call preference choice at OneTrust, being focused around everything regarding consent and preferences. And OneTrust obviously being one of the biggest CMP providers in the space and also listed as a IAB TCF compliant CMP.
Thanks. Bart, over to you.
Hi, so yeah, I manage our business development team for Benelux and Nordics at Rakuten TV and Rakuten Advertising. And obviously within CTV, many of our discussions are around how to reach that user and that household in a consent-friendly way, and in a privacy-friendly way. So that's mainly what I'm focused on.
And finally, Alex.
Hi, I'm Alex Cohn with the IAB TechLab, and I lead our efforts focused on privacy, data protection, and addressability. Happy to be here.
Thank you so much for being here. So just before we start, I just want to remind everyone that there will be Q&A at the end of the session. So do not hesitate to enter any question that you may have in the dedicated box, and we will go through them at the end. So to jump straight into today's topic, right now, CTV privacy solutions in the market seem really fragmented due to the lack of standardization in this environment. And also because the CTV space until recently hasn't really been a focal point of the discussion related to privacy and compliance with the e-privacy directive and the GDPR. What are the most prominent solutions to provide transparency and establish user consent in CTV environments?
Yeah, so I think we're just right at the beginning, and what has also been discussed in the previous session is, I think, really important that we have currently, as of now, less personalized advertising. But the second aspect is that we have a huge fragmentation across this market, which makes it a little bit more difficult to provide a solution. We have true CTV solutions, we have different stick solutions that basically offer a similar functionality than the classical CTV one. And then the complexity of TCF is coming on top. So what we see basically is that all of this together makes it quite hard for publishers to build any solution out themselves. And that's why, yeah, obviously customers are coming to OneTrust and looking to outsource to CMP vendors like us with solutions that we provide, and that I'm sure we'll discuss a little bit more in detail in the discussion today.
Yeah, sure. Bart, what are your views on this? And do you have also some insight on the requirements and behaviors of vendors participating in the selling and buying of CTV inventories coming from European publishers?
Yeah, sure. I think primarily, and to Lucas's point as well, there's one point about requirements which are pretty clear. Implementation of GDPR and all these frameworks mandatory for CTV publishers. And in terms of the privacy frameworks, CTVs are being treated like every other device. However, many of these CMPs are not built for CTV. And so collecting consent through CTVs is being done in a very similar way as what you would expect for web and mobile. But it's actually, from a user experience point of view, very hard to do that in the right way. And there's no sort of off-the-shelf solution from CMPs that you could easily just stick on a CTV app. In terms of the behavior of vendors, I think it's obvious that with most of these CTV publishers not yet using TCF frameworks, it's quite common to start using binary consent or signal like legitimate interest. And our sort of understanding and feedback from partners show that similar to web and mobile, CTV publishers will be adopting that sort of TCF framework more and more over time. And I think one of the reasons why this hasn't happened yet is exactly what I said, is the implementation of the CMP itself requires help of others, like Lukas mentioned, and it's just not something that you can easily do. And managing consent on CTVs while maintaining that ease of use is just very hard, as user experience will be lacking. So yeah, that's how we look at that.
Thanks. And Alex, do you observe also at TechLab a greater focus from stakeholder to ensure they receive users' consent for ad campaign in GDPR region, despite the complexity that Bart just mentioned? You're on mute.
Sorry. I was trying to keep it quiet until then. Yes. So in the last, I would say 5 or 6 months, I've received probably more inbounds just from CTV related vendors, CMPs working in the space, and even media companies themselves, wanting to know what we're going to do about the differences in, to Bart's point, I think also Lukas's point, the UX of CTV. Are we going to make it easy to support through technical standards? So that's really positive that the stakeholders are actually reaching out and interested in doing this. I think my current answer to them is we want to build as flexible of tech standards and hooks for signaling privacy signals through the supply chain, from the digital property or the CTV through to all the vendors. We want those to be as flexible as possible. The way, though, that we, I think, should think about approaching CTV is similar to what we've done for web with libraries, in terms of, or SDK, things that make it easier to implement, that are thoughtful for that environment. Today, we've spent a lot of time on our web libraries, less time on the mobile server-side libraries, and we have no CTV libraries. So on that front, like, that's where we need to focus our efforts. Like, a little call to action is, we're just like IAB Europe, we're member-supported organization, and we want to see those leaders who are reaching out take the lead in spearheading, creating tools that make it easier for folks to operate in CTV. But I like, the pure answer to your question is, we're seeing a lot of people ask about it, which is a good sign as a product manager of, hey, this is something we need to focus on. We obviously aren't checking all the boxes here, so we need to do more.
Thanks. I'd like to come back to Bart's point about the user experience on CTV that is really different than on web or mobile app. So as most European data protection authorities have issued specific guidelines to establish valid consent for the web and mobile app environment, but there isn't right now any dedicated guidance for the CTV space, which means that there aren't any precise rules for the CTV space and to help users understand their choices. But Rakuten has its own private CMPs. What have been the difficulties to achieve the level of transparency and offer users the granularity of choices required by the GDPR, while maintaining as much as possible ease of navigation for consumer, especially on a TV set?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the point. What I was obviously referring to earlier is building out like a granular sort of vendor and purpose selection in a CTV app would make for a very bad user experience on CTVs in general. Would you navigate with your remote control all these different settings, and would you, tick all these boxes? So instead, we chose to iterate on the initial layer of the CMP on CTVs to communicate what we think is a very clear message about the purpose and reason for asking for consent. And so, essentially what we've done is say it's either accept all, reject all, which are the straightforward actions that you can process on CTV. And then if users want to actually manage more granular consent settings, we then transfer them over to the companion device, which in our case would be like a smartphone app, a tablet, etc., where you can actually go in and manage that consent at that granular level. So for those users that do want to go in and manage that consent at a much more granular level, we actually provide them the option of moving over to that companion app. and companion device to manage that. Because I think that's essentially now what you need to start doing, is becoming much more flexible in terms of how you implement that on CTV, without making it extremely hard for users to make any sense of how they should do that with like remote control.
And I think that was one of the first CMP to be TCF validated for CTV. Can you tell us also about your solution, how it works, and the number of platforms it supports?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe to catch on Bart's point, I think this is really what we also see in the market, in the wider market, is that transparency is obviously a very important point, but it's hard to offer those choices on a remote control device to the users. That's why, of course, we have to think of other solutions. For example, as Bart mentioned, like scanning our QR code, going to a mobile device where then the user has the option to choose on this mobile device, or having a user already logged in on a mobile device where the user was able to provide the choices, and then just by logging in on the CTV with the same account, synchronizing the settings over so that there's no need for an additional choice for the user, because we already know what the user's choice will be. And I think OneTrust as a CMP vendor has proven in the past that we are taking a very collaborative approach to this. When we think back to the mobile side of things, we have exactly the same questions arising. How can we optimize user experience on mobile applications? And then we, for example, worked on getting those sticky buttons approved by the IAB to consent. And I think this will also be a good approach on work together and find out what works best together with the different CMP vendors who might have different points of views on this. To touch base more on the technical question, Ninon, that you asked, we are obviously already a CMP provider for the web and for mobile applications. And we want to just transfer this ease of use also to the CTV space. So within OneTrust, you can basically manage and maintain your CMP for CTV the same way you already do this for web and mobile applications nowadays, just following a privacy by design approach, basically. And this, from a even more technical perspective, we have created a series of native SDKs to be able to also serve the whole fragmented market around, for example, tvOS, including the app tracking transparency, Android TV, Fire TV, so also stick solutions, Tizen, Roku, and all of those different platforms. And we are trying to serve with a dedicated native SDK, including also the UI components, to make it as easy as possible for our customers to implement, and not forgetting at the same time that we have many international customers who might not just worry about the IAB TCF for Europe, but also maybe the IAB for CCPA in the US, and then having solutions for all of those different frameworks across the globe.
And so despite this layer of complexity, how do you encourage adoption among publishers to pick up a CMP solution for their CTV apps? Do you think that the market is ready to move into the right direction for users' privacy?
Yeah, very good question. And I'd say what we currently see is that we have quite small and agile teams at our customers dealing with this topic, but unluckily they are not in control of the dates being set by the walled gardens like Apple or Google. However, someone has to account for this, and we see more and more privacy advocates at our customers really taking care of this and being like responsible and also accountable for this, which is quite a positive shift in my opinion. And then together with the vendor side, primarily the SSPs in this case, who are pushing for like a valid consent gathering, those privacy advocates, they help us to drive the adoption within their organization. But of course, sometimes priorities are changing dynamically, especially in this area, also when new frameworks or new regulations are being laid out. So it's definitely more like a marathon than a sprint, also because of the technical fragmentation of the market. But to answer your question, I definitely would say that the industry is ready. We just need to get it kicked off now.
Yeah, definitely. And so you mentioned fragmentation as being a big challenge for CTV consent. And another challenge as well is that for most families, connected TV is also a household device, so not an individual one, like a cell phone or a computer. So it means that consent and preferences need to be managed both for the household and individual levels at the same time. But how does it translate in terms of consent collection and ultimately content or ad personalization?
I think that's the sort of question that we probably should be asking as an industry. Personally, I think that we might even want to start treating CTVs differently from more personal devices like your smartphone. If you look at it, I think TVs are the least personal medium in your household, as we typically don't even know who's actually in front of that screen. The user that managed consent settings might not be that user that's currently consuming the content. And additionally, and probably contrary to standard digital advertising, which has been that ideal environment for reaching and targeting individuals at scale, with CTV, viewing behaviors really change. And in most cases, CTV is being consumed by multiple people in the room, family, roommates, friends, etc. And if you consider that, 75% of CTV viewers are actually watching with at least one other person in the room, that makes for a very different consent conversation, I think. And probably despite we all know that to be true, we're still all trying to gather consent and opt-ins through like personal identifiers, like, an email address. And this has been mentioned, I think, throughout this event, but the cookieless world will become a reality next year. And we're already starting to think about how do you cope with that change. And this is also a good time to start thinking differently about CTV as a channel for personalized one-to-one ads, and really start focusing your attention towards more meaningful engagement at the household level. I think CTV can actually be a force for good in that ecosystem when you start understanding the need to apply that thinking into your campaign strategy. Personalization on CTV is always going to be less personal than digital advertising has been, but there's still many things that you can achieve over probably the coming years. So starting to utilize the data that we already have at the household level, increasing the relevance and UX without becoming intrusive is, I think, key. When you think of an example, say that when we know that a specific household consists of a family with young kids, at Rakuten TV, we might know that they're watching specific kids shows that are aimed at toddlers. Their parents are probably aged between 35 and 49. They have a 60-inch high-end smart device, and they're located in a specific wealthy area. Then if I am a car manufacturer, would it make sense that I advertise my small town car versus my high-end luxury family car range to this family? So I think with CTV, with programmatic, and with all the options available, you can run multiple targeted campaigns to these sorts of groups of individuals. And as one car manufacturer, you can run 20 different campaigns at the same time programmatically while still applying consent at the household level. So it's going to require a big change in thinking and in the industry, but eventually if we start thinking like that and start behaving like that, I think we can only do better than what we do today.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe let's come back to the lack of standardization in CTV environment. IAB TechLab has been working on a number of standards and guidelines to deliver consistency and efficiency in the CTV supply chain in different functional areas. When it comes to privacy and consent, Alex, you mentioned it already, but what elements are still being discussed from a technical point of view?
Yeah, I think to build on what I mentioned earlier, we're doing a few things, and this, I think maybe it was Lukas who mentioned this. We need to first, I feel like, to make our standards compelling for those who need to implement them technically, like on the back end. So if you're a CMP, you're building to the APIs that we've designed. If you're a vendor, you have to be able to consume from those APIs. To really first make our solutions compelling, we need to be able to support more markets just in one, we've been using the word framework, but one sort of platform technical approach. So right now we're focused at TechLab on, okay, I know we're focused on Europe here right now, but like we've got, I think it was Lukas who mentioned it, we've got, or Bart maybe, multiple regions that are now privacy laws, data protection laws are coming on the books. So we're focused on, can we get one technical backend to support different, like flexibility in different regions? So we're focused on that first. I think then is another carrot to adopting like new standards. We need to be offering things that we didn't offer before in terms of what we offer for US privacy today, which is very limited. What we offer for TCF today, it's complex, but again, we focus first on web and mobile. So I think one of the things I think that we'll sequence after we figure out how do we support multiple markets in one technical backend is how do we start making new channels easier to work with? One of the first, we've got a spec out in public comment right now. One of the first comments that came in was actually from a CTV provider saying, is what you're doing now going to work for us? And I grabbed some time with him because I was like, that's a nuanced answer, because I shared with him what I just shared with you is we're trying to get this done first and then focus on how do we expand new channels. So since you asked, I'll plug this again. We need CMPs like OneTrust. We need brands that are offering their own CMPs, but also like vendors in the ecosystem like Rakuten but more, right? Like leaning into what we're doing, because at the end of the day, we're member driven. So if you have proposals for technically what we could do to support CTV better, like we're open for business on that. We have a working group focused on it. We can prioritize that work. Like it wouldn't be like it was out of left field. So if you're in this space and you have ideas of how the standards can evolve to better support CTV, please bring them. We're not going to shoot them down. Like we know that this is going to be an important piece of getting adoption of these broader platform standards that we're building right now, like global privacy platform.
Bart, what are your thoughts on this? Well, maybe what are the advantages of leveraging TCF? And as Alex mentioned, what can be done further so that this standard supports the CTV environment better?
It's going to be a difficult question. I think from a CTV publisher point of view, the first thing that's probably going to need to evolve is the offering of CMP products available today in general. There's a couple of companies, obviously, like OneTrust, that have started developing and helping CTV publishers like ourselves implement those CMPs. So there is definitely an increasing interest from publishers on this topic. But I actually think that most publishers' interests are driven by the requirements set by DSPs, privacy compliance, law, etc. I think the growth of the market is probably the best catalyst here, and it seems that TCF is the only option, right? The main challenge that we should solve is probably how to deliver that message to the user properly, as we're not used to reading texts off of TV screens. And so the sort of initial CMP layer overall and the way that we communicate this has to change. But probably we as an industry need to negotiate, need to, as Alex said, need to start discussing this with bodies like the IAB to make it even more like concise than what mobile and web CMPs would usually offer. So opening up that conversation with the IAB and with many different publishers and tech vendors in that space will eventually get us to a place where I think we need to end up. But yeah, there's still a lot of work to do.
Yeah, and this is definitely also something to pick up with DPAs as well, to understand what would be their requirements specifically for CTV. Lukas, before we move to the question, would you like to give a word of advice to the audience when it comes to privacy in the CTV space?
Yeah, sure. So I think what really is the new goal is transparency and trust. And you should think of that you make sure to gain that trust by just providing consistent mechanisms for transparency and choice to your users, no matter what platforms they are using at this moment, because they will notice that you are still using their data. So you should make just sure that you're communicating this. And of course, ideally, this would be, depending on whether it's a household device or not, what Bart was always mentioning, synchronized across devices if it's not a household device, or providing any other mechanism of transparency, for example, with a scanning of a QR code for household devices, where then each and every user who basically steps in can provide its own preferences. And this will just help us to streamline the user experience further, and I think also help us to ensure adoption over time.
And Bart, same question from the...
I think many things that Lukas said are probably true there. I think for us, the user is core to what we do. Without that user, we can't have a business, and a flourishing business at that. So I think earning that user's trust and making sure that whatever you do, you at least make sure that they understand what we're doing with that data and how that data is being used is very important. And for us, just to give you a bit of an understanding, at the current moment, we have about a 70% opt-in rate, which is extremely high. And I think that's primarily driven by the fact that we are communicating in a very clear and concise way, and we are providing that option, right? So I think that sort of notion needs to come more into the industry, that you can negotiate on behalf of the user. It needs to be clear, and transitioning into next year, more and more that will be adopted by an industry, also in web and mobile and all other aspects. So I think this is a time for us to innovate in that space and to really look ahead and see how can we best adopt these practices, not deteriorating user experience, but making sure that they understand what they're doing, and at the same time helping advertisers understand how they should eventually use those signals in not just targeting individuals, but targeting households and targeting broader groups of audiences.
Thanks. And Alex, maybe a word of advice to contribute to the working group, probably?
Yeah, this is, again, a plug sort of for us, but I think that's why we're here. Everyone comes to IAB Europe, they come to TechLab because they want to collaborate. Fragmentation, I think, in privacy and data protection experiences is driving a lot of the fear that users have. Not all of it, but a lot of it, because if you're one place and something feels totally different and the choices are different than another place, as you move around devices, including your TV, your ability to comprehend any of what you've just done is low, and you're like, why is this all different? Like, why? If we keep moving in a fragmented direction, I think the sort of privacy disruption that is also causing changes to how we do addressability and can we do measurement and attribution. If we don't address the fragmentation, the things that are happening in web and mobile are going to come to TV in terms of you're going to be able to do less. The TV OS providers are going to do the same thing that Google and Apple are doing. So I think it would be great to get ahead of that. And one way to get ahead of that, at least the fragmentation part, is leaning into actual standards. Again, it's not like it's easy. We've now heard that, right? The experience is different. Not just the user experience of what's on the device, but like the people who are sitting in front of it, it's different. So we've got to acknowledge that, but acknowledge it together and try to work on it together, because if we all do separate things, I think it's going to be a mess for users and really contribute to more concern about what's happening to my data and the things that are really at the heart of getting consent. So that's my advice, is like lean into collaboration, lean into working, helping IAB Europe develop like corollaries for CTV, lean into helping out on reaching out to DPAs, like Ninon said, and trying to get guidance on how the CTV experience could be different.
Thanks. I completely agree with this thread that smart TV manufacturer or CTV OS provider might follow the same movement as browsers and mobile operating system when it comes to data sharing. So standardization is probably the best way forward to prevent this. We have a question from the audience saying that currently there is a limited CMP solution for CMPs, for publishers, sorry, with only 6 CTV CMP solution registered with the IAB and only one really offering a solution in market. It also says that many DSP now are starting to buy against valid consent string. When we start to see this solution fully rolled out for CTV? Lukas, maybe?
Yeah, so I think it's true that there is, of course, just a limited amount of CMP providers that offer solutions for the CTV and also wider OTT space. But if you look at how that looked just like a couple of months ago, you will see that strong development in this space, and you will find that if you just take a look back 12 months, I think there hasn't been any provider who was able to serve any of those use cases. And now we have 6 or 7 already listed on the IAB TCF list, and probably a lot more working on providing solutions.
Yeah, we have 9 listed now, and a lot of them are still in the process of getting validated.
Yeah, so I think we see where the direction is going. It's a really positive trend. And we will also see that more and more vendors will probably have standardized solutions for the fragmented world. We are entering the space from OneTrust side. We have already many native SDKs, including the user interface out there, but I'm sure other vendors will follow.
And Bart, what led you at Rakuten to build your own private CMP?
I think one of the things that is difficult for us as a sort of publisher is that we believe in sort of the distribution of content much more than consumption in our own app. So we are more and more becoming a publisher where we have loads of content and really good content, and we want viewers to have easy access to the content. Last week or the week before, we announced another step in our partnership, for instance, with Samsung and Samsung TV Plus, where we've launched, I think, 166 channels, streaming channels in 16 markets through their app. And so then all of a sudden, on the Samsung side, they're managing consent on our content. We are managing consent in our app ourselves. And so we need to come up with a solution whereby we can manage consent not just within our own environment, within our own app, but also within environments of other apps. And so that's really why we started working on a private CMP solution where obviously we work together with parties in the industry that actually build CMPs. So we're not like developing ourselves, but we need some sort of customization there to ensure that we're future-proofing that solution and being able to transfer consent or pass along consent strings within the ecosystem. So I think those are things that we took into consideration there. But passing along these consent strings to DSPs and etc. is proving to be already quite a big challenge.
Thanks. I think we're a bit over time, so thank you, Lukas, Bart, and Alex for your insight and expertise on the topic. I think it was lots of learnings and food for thought on the privacy and compliance challenges in the CTV space. I will now hand over to David to close today's event.
Thank you, Ninon.
Yes, thank you, Ninon, Lukas, Bart, and Alex. Important discussion which has raised many issues and provided some thoughts as user consent and privacy best practices.